Very special thanks to Car Connect in Bristol for providing the car in this review. Their stock ranges from affordable family cars all the way up to the more specialised stuff, such as the Maserati in this review. So if you are in the Bristol area, click the link down in the video description and check out their current stock. The effects of time on a performance car are a fascinating thing to look at. You can have two cars from the same year. One car will be called things like long in the tooth or dated, and another will be called timeless or ahead of its time or a modern classic. It's kind of funny because they're pieces of metal, and yet it's absolutely true. Two cars can age and date very, very differently to each other. And of course, when you're talking about that as just a car fan, it's very different to being a potential buyer. And of course, my on-the-road reviews are geared towards that class of people in particular. Not just car fans, but people who are actually thinking about buying one. And considering that I am a former Maserati owner and a car mechanic, I think I'm more than qualified about discussing the potential perils and advantages of buying and owning a Maserati as, crucially, a daily driver, not just a weekend toy. Now, I'm not going to go fully into a comparison video or a showdown between my Maserati and this one, although I may do that in the future because they are in a similar price bracket these days. For now, we're looking and honing in more on this car, a 2002 Maserati Coupe. Now, of course, Coupe is a relative term. Maserati has made loads of them. The Gran Turismo's a Coupe, this one's a Coupe, its predecessor was, even way back in the day to stuff like the Cam's-in, it's also a Coupe. So more specifically, this is in fact the 4200 GT. Now, the interesting thing, one of the crucial differences when it comes to the setup and the spec and the engineering between this car and the one which came before it, the 3200 GT, is that the engines in those two vehicles are way more different than you'd think. You'd assume, understandably so if you didn't know any better, that, well, one's a 3.2, one's a 4.2, that's true. Then you'd probably think, well, if the 4.2's a V8, then chances are the 3.2's probably a V6, which kind of sounds like a little bit of an under-par Maserati. But that's the interesting thing. The 3200 GT actually is not a V6, it's a twin-turbo V8. This is a naturally aspirated V8. Very, very different approaches to power and performance. And even if you compare this 4.2 litre V8, which of course, like all Maseratis up until recently, was a Ferrari-Maserati collaboration, even my Quattroporte, despite having that 4.2 litre V8 as well, actually has a different spec. This is less powerful than the 2005 Quattroporte, despite having the same engine size and even the same Cambiocorsa style gearbox. Now, I have thoughts on the Cambiocorsa gearbox, that's for sure. It was one of the issues that my car had. I hear better things about the ZF of the later models, and this 4200 GT was in production for longer than just up until 2002. If I recall correctly, I think they continued it until around something like 2006, I think. That may have been in the Grand Sport form though, so that's worth double checking. As far as finding one, the better prices, not too surprisingly, do tend to be on the earlier machines. Like this one, 2002, it's about a 10 grand car. That's incidentally more than I paid for my Quattroporte, which was a newer machine but still more affordable, partially because you find more Quattroportes for sale than you do these. So, just before I get into the potential and certainly realistic perils of owning a Maserati and using it as a daily driver as I did, let's talk about the good stuff first. Stuff like the looks, the sound, the performance, what can you actually expect? So what is it like in that regard? Well, I actually found the comparison fascinating between this and my car, because of course there are certain things you would assume would be different. One's a larger 4-door, 2-ton limo, and one is a 2-door, 2+2 GT. With 385 horsepower, this is just under a 180 mile an hour machine, so slightly quicker than the Maserati Quattroporte, which is also over a 170 mile an hour saloon. 0 to 60, they're similar, around 5 seconds, the Quattroporte just over, this one just under, so again, for its power, that's very good. But one of the things that I knew would be very different even before I drove this car was the weight. it's a good 300 kilos lighter than the Quattroporte, despite the fact that they both have 4 seats. So for the sacrifice of 2 doors and a little bit of length, you actually get a huge advantage in weight. And trust me, you can feel it. Now, the interesting thing about the 4200 GT is even though it's smaller than the Quattroporte, which is a relative term, it's kind of like saying one cruise liner is smaller than another, it is still big for a coupe. It's actually a full foot longer than the Porsche 911 of the time, the 996 shape. A foot longer is a big deal. But the interesting thing is, it's still not as spacious as I was hoping. Now, I believe the Gran Turismo is a more spacious option, but they tend to be a more expensive option as well, even in their used form. So as far as that space goes, which of course is something that I always like to discuss in these reviews, since I'm a bigger guy, I need more space in my car, what are my thoughts on this one? Well, I actually have a very interesting and specific thought as far as if you are a taller guy. Not just a big guy, but maybe just a taller guy, a lanky guy, let's say. I would strongly recommend that if you must have a 3200 or a 4200 GT Maserati, really look for the open top. The convertible, or the Spider, has such an advantage for obvious reasons in headroom, it could well make all the difference. Because I will freely admit, as a Maserati fanboy, that the headroom is not good in this car. I hit my head a couple of times driving it, just going over small bumps, and that was with the seat in the most copious position it could be in. Now, it wasn't uncomfortable to drive, I want to be clear on that. It had enough space, just not as much as I'm used to. Being in a Quattroporte half the time and a Touareg the rest of the time, they're much bigger vehicles. As far as those rear seats go though, well actually that's one of the better things about the 4200. It's a proper 2+2. Now with me in the front, it's more like a 3-seater, but with an average sized person in their driver's seat, you can easily get a couple of your kids in the back, which makes it a more than usable 2+2 everyday GT if you want it to be. Now in terms of that performance, to get back to that for just a second, it's not just the 300 kilos that's cut out compared to the Quattroporte, it really is more than that. The performance on paper, as I said earlier on, isn't that much different. They're both around 170, 180 miles an hour, 0 to 60, just over 5 seconds. It's the cornering and the responsiveness which really changes between the two cars. Now when I drove the Quattroporte, in particular after the Touareg V10, and to be clear, I like the handling on my Touareg, the Maserati is just a different league, and of course it is. It's an obvious statement, but when you actually experience it, it makes that statement more real. It's such a sharp handling car, it feels nothing like a 2-ton limo. This makes the Quattroporte feel like the Touareg did to the Quattroporte in comparison. This is so nimble and so slick through corners, it's sharp, it's very playful, it's ready to go all the time. But that is a crucial point in my review that I'm going to come back to in a second in terms of who should and shouldn't buy this car. But to stay on point for just a second with that handling, everything about this machine, the brakes, the throttle, and I'm not just talking about acceleration, I mean actual pedal response, the steering itself more so than the handling, everything is razor sharp. The car is on it, dead set, focused all the time. This car never lets up, it's never not ready to play, it always wants to go. It feels like a borderline, cup car on the street, like a weekend racer. It wouldn't surprise you at all if you got in and had a bucket seat and a roll cage. It feels like that kind of turned on attitude that the vehicle has, ready to race all the time. However, to go back to my point about a potential buyer, that is the biggest crucial difference between this and the Quattroporte. The Quattroporte is very impressive through corners. It's phenomenal, in fact. And one of the reasons why is that even though it's front engine, it actually has more weight over the rear. It's like a 49-51 bias. For a 2-ton limo, it's fantastic, but it's good in a smooth way. It's controlled, it feels as big as it is, but not as heavy as it is. This car feels smaller than it is, feels lighter, which is fantastic for performance, but for certain drivers, I believe maybe, for instance, an older gentleman who's looking to use his Maserati a lot, it might actually be too playful for you. Now, if you're a younger guy, you'll probably absolutely love it. I tend to have a little bit of an old man's mentality when it comes to my cars. I kind of like big, lazy, smooth power. I mean, Touareg, Maserati Quattroporte, of course I do. This one to me is a lot of fun, but it also demands focus all the time. And I'm sure that if I compared it to something like a Lotus Exige or an Ariel Atom, this would feel sedate. But within Maserati, comparing it to a car of a similar time, with the same amount of seats, and crucially within the same price range, the Quattroporte, well, in that regard, they are very different animals. I would most definitely recommend considering this one and trying to test drive one if you can find one, but I would also strongly recommend, before you make the decision, and this is obvious, drive a Quattroporte as well, because the approach to performance, and in particular the handling, is very, very different. The Quattroporte can be playful when you want it to be, but it's also more than capable of being sedate. This car is hotter, the cabin gets a lot warmer, the engine, the smells, everything is more visceral. It feels like, as I said, it wants to play all the time. That could get tiresome for a potentially, older driver who just wants something that's more of a comfortable long-distance GT. The Quattroporte is that as well. Now, to me, that is probably the most important single difference between the two cars, because for the look, for the sound, for the price, they almost cancel each other out to some degree. But my final thoughts for this review are going to turn, of course, to what I said regarding the risks. I talk about something called the calculated risk a lot on the channel. The cars that I've owned have certainly been calculated risks. So far I've had a great one with the Touareg V10 and a not so great one with the Quattroporte, which I ended up selling because it was unreliable. So once again, just because I'm a fanboy of the brand doesn't mean I can't admit its failings. And when it comes to reliability, it is going to break. And I say that as a former owner. It's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when, and crucially it's also a matter of what, because of course breaking is a relative term, kind of like how a write-off on your insurance is a very relative term. What breaks on something can vary from, a seat cup holder all the way up to an engine rebuild, so it depends what goes wrong. That is the kind of calculated risk that I'm talking about, because with a Maserati, of course, the cost to repair it is going to be much more significant than some other sports car rivals. Maybe some are Japanese, or maybe even an American option like a Corvette, which might be a little bit more expensive to find and a little bit rarer here in the UK, but very easy to find parts for with a lot of GM sourced stuff. So with a Maserati, of course, even though it's 20 years on, or close enough, it's still an exclusive car that shares a lot of Ferrari tech, so you've got to be prepared for that. Contrary to what certain people would probably say about a Maserati though, there are plenty of people who would say, well, if it's that unreliable, or even potentially unreliable, well, why would you even try it in the first place? Just avoid it at all costs and get something that is a better option. I can understand that mentality, but if that is your mentality, you're also not a Maserati buyer, and you don't really have the Maserati mentality. It's the kind of car where you have to buy it knowing the risks, but you have to kind of be okay with them, and that is why I believe that I purchased mine probably at the wrong time. The needs that I had in my driving daily life weren't really suited to a Quattroporte. They are suited to the Touareg V10, which is still exotic and rare, but it's just a different kind of exotic and rare. To me, the Maserati is the kind of car that you need to have maybe even as a second option, something that you can use every day, but don't necessarily need to rely on. That is what I would recommend as far as either this or a Quattroporte. Either way, you'll have a ton of fun, but they are, as I said, very different animals in terms of how they deliver their performance. The 4200 GT, and although it's not in this review, I would assume probably the 3200 as well to some degree, are very, very playful. They feel very youthful, very fun, very visceral, and every bit what you'd want from a Ferrari Maserati crossover, everything down to the stunning sound that it makes, which I'll freely admit is even more impressive than the Quattroporte was. But then the Quattroporte, on the other hand, is the more sensible option. The extra 2 doors, the luggage space is a little bit better, and of course the extra legroom thanks to the 4 doors. It's a little bit smoother and more comfortable for long journeys, so it all depends on what you need. If you're worried that much about the reliability, I would recommend don't get any Maserati of this time, because it's too much of a risk for you. If you're willing to take that on, kind of like a beautiful work of art that has a slight risk of catching on fire every so often, Do you still want the painting on your wall and take that risk, or would you rather go for something else? That's the choice that you need to make. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, if you're new to the channel and want to check out my other reviews, including for the Quattroporte, then click here on screen and stick around on the channel for more in future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.